Hi and welcome to Photo IQ. I'm your instructor Gus Cantivero, and this is Unit 9 for Camera Basics. We're going to talk all about your exposure modes, your focus modes, and your metering modes. Let's get started. By now you should have had time to practice with your primary controls of your camera. But just in case you're still confused, some cameras have some fidgety ways of actually controlling those different settings. Most cameras on the top will have some form of a mode dial. In fact, almost all the camera brands, with the exception of Fujifilm, will have mode dials on there. And then even within some of the Fujifilm models, there's going to be varying degrees of how those mode dials are interacted with. Some of the lower end cameras, the entry-level cameras, those are going to have straight up mode dials that show you which mode that you're going to be activating, while the more advanced ones are going to have the modes broken out into the primary controls. Basically, the exposure modes are the way that you're going to tell your camera how you want it to behave. You're going to tell it to what degree you want it to drive for you, to decide what the exposure ought to be, what the settings should be. And it's going to be based on the scenario and your preference as a user of the camera. Not all the modes are going to be right for every scenario, and not all the modes are going to be right for every photographer, because it's going to depend on how much control you like to have, how much you've memorized the location of the controls, and how you set up your customized buttons to be able to access the different controls that you want at a moment's notice. So sometimes you're going to need to kind of practice a little bit with some of the semi-automatic modes to be able to decide how is best for you to use the camera. It's also going to inform your decision on how you're going to want to set up your custom buttons. There are a lot of tutorials out there that say, you know, this is the way you should set up your camera, this is the way you should customize your buttons, this is the best way that you should set up your buttons. And anybody who asks me about these, what's the best this or the best that or the only way to do, there is no only way to do anything. And there is no necessarily best way to do anything, because everything depends on how you want it to operate. I prefer to shoot in full manual mode, but that doesn't mean I never use automatic mode. And it also doesn't mean that you can't get great results with using some kind of an auto assist function. It all depends on how much you are in tune with your camera's ability to read those scenarios. Every camera is going to be different with the way it analyzes the situation. If it sees a backlit subject, it's going to get confused. Do you want the subject to be in proper exposure, or do you want to keep the whole situation in balance? Or do you want to ignore that foreground shadow and just expose for the highlight behind me? That's going to be up to you as the user to decide, and it's going to depend on how you set up your primary controls to be able to read the scenario. So with that in mind, let's start to get into some of these exposure modes so that we can understand what we're dealing with. One important thing to remember is that almost all the cameras are going to use the same acronyms or iconology across the board, which is really helpful. So no matter what kind of camera you have, you're going to be able to understand what this stuff means. There's going to be, some are going to be a little bit more abbreviated than others. Some are going to use some longer hand terminology, but I'm going to teach you how to read that stuff, so you're going to know exactly what you're looking at. So first and foremost, let's look at some of the pictures that are beside me and this bulleted list. There's M, which is full manual. AV, or sometimes abbreviated as just A, is aperture priority. And you're going to say, why is it aperture priority if it's AV? Well, it's value, because we're talking about exposure value. You will see EV as another acronym, and we're going to see that later on. So remember, if you're looking at your scene, you're looking at the light value. The camera does not look at an image in terms of what is in the image. It's not smart enough to analyze yet, and we're getting there, because it is able to analyze a face, it is able to lock onto an eye, multiple different faces in a scenario, but it still doesn't know the photographer's intent. The camera can only know, yeah, it looks like you probably are taking a picture of people, so I'm going to put the people in focus. but that might not necessarily be your intent. You may want to forget the people and just use them as sort of scenery for the location, which is the primary focus, and have the people just sort of moving through. So the camera is not smart enough to know necessarily what the photographer or the artist's intent is. So when the camera looks at a scene, it is looking at terms of tones of gray. It's going from white to black. Actually, in the scene that we're in here, I have white with the TV here, and I have black with my background. So that's the extreme white to the extreme dark. So if you think about it in terms of a grayscale, where it goes from white to black, you should be able to understand that is what the value is of the scene. There's a light and a tone value. Your meter, which is going to measure in terms of what it thinks an accurate exposure is, and what it thinks an overexposure is, and what it thinks an underexposure is. When you set your value, your exposure value, that is what the camera is going to use as its baseline to try and decide what your exposure should be. Then beyond that, it's going to have to decide whether you want to prioritize the different artistic features of your controls. Do you want to prioritize your aperture and your depth of field, as in to say, I want a deep depth of field or a very shallow depth of field? Or do I want it to prioritize a long or a fast shutter speed in order to maintain sharpness in motion, or maybe I want motion blur? And you're going to have to decide which of those three primary controls you want to prioritize. So is it going to be AV, aperture value, or aperture priority, sometimes abbreviated as just A? Is it going to be TV, which is time value, basically your shutter priority, the shutter speed? Or is it going to be P for program, which prioritizes your ISO? And then lastly, there's auto for full auto. And then different brands are going to have variations on that. There's going to be I auto, which is seen on Panasonic and some other brands. And that basically means intelligent auto, where you're able to tell it whether it's a backlit scene or if it's a night scene, indoors, fireworks, the winter time with snow, where it's a very high key, bright white scene. And then the camera is going to have a little bit more information to go on and decide how it should handle the light in those situations. It still is never going to be better than your own eye and your own intelligence to decide how the scene should be handled. But it is going to be faster when really all you want to do is sort of create a shortcut for how you want to get there. But honestly, if I have to go through the time to select what the scene is, I could have already just changed the settings and taken the shot. There isn't really, I think, a benefit to using intelligent auto. When we look at some of these dial examples, you can see one from the Olympus EM10 Mark III, Panasonic Lumix G7, Canon T7i, and a Sony A7R II. You can see that they're not all the same, but they're very similar. You can see that each one of them has M, S, A, and P, and they're all in that same order. It's always going to be in that order. However, on the Canon T7i, you can see that it's actually in a slightly different order, where you have manual, then aperture value, and then time value or shutter priority. Whereas on the other three, they all say MSAP. So the shutter and the aperture on the Canon have been reversed. That is really no significance at all, other than the fact that just to see that it's not always exactly the same. But you can see beneath program is always some auto function. And then beyond there, depending on the size of the dials, the Canon T7i, being a DSLR sized camera, has a larger physical dial and they can fit more on there. So you can see mixed in after program is auto, and then there's a no flash mode, and then there's creative auto, then there's portraiture, landscape, macro function, sports, and then there's a scene selector, and then that last one, I'm not sure, that might be color effects. And then on the other cameras, there's varying degrees of mixtures of that, and they all pretty much are saying the same thing. One difference is that on the Sony, there's a 1 and a 2 that you can see, which is between the manual and the movie mode, and those are for custom modes, which you can set up as the user to apply some custom mixed color profiles or different kinds of looks that you want to apply to those. So if you want to quickly go to a black and white mode that you have saved, you can switch the dial over to, say, Creative 1, and that will be your black and white profile, which is a fun way to work. It makes it quick for you to switch around and have something that's sort of your go-to look that you've made for yourself. On the screen now you can see my Fuji X-T3, and the reason why I'm showing this one is because they have a little bit different approach to the mode selections, and I want to make sure that you understand what you're looking at before you go out and make a purchase, or if you're looking to maybe switch platforms, this will give you a little bit of an insight to whether or not you might be interested in changing or upgrading from a lower end entry-level camera that Fuji might offer. One of the things about the Fuji system is that they try to have a lot of physical manual controls at your disposal. And you'll see on the screen next to me the three primary controls, the aperture, the ISO, and the shutter speed, all swing around to have a red A indicated on there. Now, why is that? Well, since the aperture priority mode would basically be switching the mode dial to A, what that is going to do is going to take out of function your manual aperture control. It's going to put it on auto. So rather than having aperture priority mode and waste a dial on top here because they've already got dials for your primary controls, you simply just adjust the f-stop ring and you go past 22 and you go right to A, and that's going to put your camera's aperture into auto. Likewise, you can get your ISO and you can dial it around to A and put your ISO into auto mode. And at that point, you're now in aperture auto and ISO auto, and you still have manual control over your shutter speed. Then if you want to put your shutter speed into auto, you just dial it over to A, and now all three primary controls are in auto. And you can also change these to any combination that you like. So it actually functions in the exact same way that the manual shutter aperture program, MSAP, mode dial would do, letting you choose which one of the primary controls you want to have control over. But it just is actually a little bit faster because you can swing everything into auto and then just as quickly turn your aperture back to whatever f-stop you want it to be at, or just adjust your shutter speed or your ISO to whatever you want it to be. So next, let's talk about an important feature that works in tandem with your auto modes, and that's going to be the exposure value or the exposure compensation dial. Some cameras will have a physical dial, other cameras will just have a button that enables the adjustment of your exposure value. So you'll see beside me I have three different camera examples, all with a different method of, or a different location of the adjustment. Some cameras will have the adjustment on the top of the camera, some cameras will have it on the back side of the camera. Some cameras will have a physical dial, such as my Fuji X-T3, as well as my Sony a7R II. Both of those cameras have physical dials for the exposure compensation. So you'll see, if you remember from Unit 8, we talked about your how to achieve perfect exposure, and one of the photography terms that we talked about was stops. So remember that term and go back and refer to it if you need to. But on the physical dials, typically, some of them will be more, but typically they're going to have 3 stops over and 3 stops under. So what that basically means is that when you're looking at the scene, the camera is going to decide what it thinks your perfect exposure should be. Then, depending on whether you want something to be underexposed, such as something that's in a shadow, maybe the camera is going to say, oh, you obviously want to see into this shadow, and it's going to overexpose the scene. Well, perhaps you want to underexpose that, so what you're going to do is use your exposure compensation dial or button, and you're going to tell the camera to start underexposing, and then with either the LCD preview screen on the back or your EVF or just using your meter, you're going to have to tell the camera to keep underexposing until it gets to the desired exposure. So you would use the physical dial here, or in the case of the Nikon D3500 or the T7i and other cameras, there's going to be this little plus and minus button. And you'll see that here. It says plus, minus, plus, minus. That's a universal icon. That is always going to mean your exposure value. So when you hit that button, sometimes you have to press and hold it and then adjust the top or the front command wheel or you can press it once, it's going to activate that adjustment, and then you can just adjust using your finger dial. Sometimes the dial is in the front, and sometimes it's on the top. Another thing that is very common amongst them, and pretty much exclusively the same across the board, is that it's always going to be adjusted in third stop increments. Next, let's talk about some specifics to your camera that you're gonna have to go grab your camera to look at and figure out. Does your camera have both front and rear dials? If it does, that's very helpful because it means that you'll have fewer modifier buttons that you have to hit. You may need to select what kind of function you want that to have. Some cameras by default will come with different functions assigned to different buttons, but very typically that if you do have a front dial, usually that is going to adjust your shutter speed. If you also have a rear dial, so one for your index finger and one for your thumb, the rear one is usually going to adjust your aperture. And then if you want to adjust your ISO, usually, I have to say usually because I can't be sure exactly what every single camera comes set to, but usually if you want to adjust your ISO, there's going to be another modifier button for the ISO, or in my case, on my camera, I have this rear wheel assigned to my ISO. So all three of my primary controls have a dedicated button, or rather dial, associated with them. You'll see beside me, on the Canon T7i, on the top, there is an ISO button. So you're gonna use that, there's only one wheel on the grip of the Canon T7i, and that is gonna be at the top of the camera. So you're going to have to, it's already assigned to your shutter speed. And then if you want to change your ISO, you're going to tap with your index finger that ISO button and then adjust with the wheel. And then if you want to adjust your aperture, on the back side, the same button that has the plus minus for the exposure compensation, you're going to use your thumb to hit that and then adjust with the wheel, and that will adjust your aperture. So I'm gonna guess that that button, because it's a dual function, is going to automatically turn into exposure compensation when you are set to auto. And when you're on manual, it's going to be set as your aperture adjustment. Then beside it, with the Nikon D3500, that also only has one dial. It's gonna be this dial that's on the right-hand side of the grip, and that's in perfect position for your thumb, so it's a thumb wheel. Then if you want to adjust your exposure compensation value, it's also, just like the Canon, it has the exact same function where it's the exposure compensation, and then it's also the aperture button. So once again, I'm guessing when you're set to auto, it becomes exposure compensation. When you're set to manual, it becomes aperture. You're gonna press that with your index finger, and then with your thumb, you can make the adjustment necessary. Then if you want to adjust your ISO, you would use the I button that's on the back side. Tap that one, it's going to activate your ISO adjustment. For mirrorless cameras, they're going to be a lot more programmable. As I mentioned, on my A7R II, there's a rear thumb wheel, and I set that one to be my ISO, so I don't have to hit any modifier buttons. I don't have to enter any menus. It just automatically is set to my ISO. And since I usually shoot in manual at least 99% of the time, I'm almost never in auto. That's where my primary controls stay. And I have no reason to confuse myself with changing. There's a muscle memory involved, and I'm able to adjust those settings without even thinking about it. When I shot with DSLR, I had modifier buttons that I had to press in order to adjust certain functions, and you just get used to it. It just takes practice. Once you have a few long days shooting with them, on manual, where you force yourself to practice with it, you will develop the muscle memory necessary to know exactly where your controls are. Okay, that's the end of Unit 9 for Camera Basics, where we discussed exposure modes and how to adjust your controls to achieve perfect exposure. I hope you learned a lot. Get out there and practice with these modes so that you can understand how to make them work for you. I hope to see you in the next lesson. Until next time, keep shooting.